behalf of the faculty and staff of Colorado College, welcome. We have been here since 1874, and if you remember our Colorado history, that's 2 years before Colorado became a state. But I also want to welcome you to the block plan. Have you noticed something about campus today? It's pretty quiet, right? That's because we just finished our first block. We've had 3.5 weeks of intensive studying, and now the students get 4.5 days of block break. And that's the way our block plan works, is every semester we study intensely for the period, and then we get a break. So, we have small group discussions. Professors know your name. I just finished a class of 18 students. We encourage you to grow here and respect your stride. Welcome to block breaks. Again, our students are on that now, where you can relax. I know some of my students are doing that. Some of my students are out in the mountains. Some are hiking, many of our 54 14ers, or they're out in exploring the sand dunes in Colorado and in Utah. Welcome to our vibrant intellectual community. About 2,000 students who are all eager to communicate, debate, defend, think, and engage. But what's great about Colorado College is that these conversations don't end when you leave the classroom, but expand in every corner as friends and peers relentlessly urge you to think outside the box, prosper, and expand your views. So if and when you are a student here, you have 32 blocks for unearthing your passions, exploring and understanding the world, and your individual growth. Colorado College is happy to provide the Colorado Pledge, and if attending this here is of interest to you, I encourage you to speak with you, whoever about the Colorado Pledge. So, in short, welcome to Colorado College. We're really glad that you're here. Now I'd like to introduce Karen Burkhart from the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council.
Good morning and welcome to the annual high school symposium. I am Karen Burkhart. I am the executive director of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council. We are so happy to be here once again, and so pleased to see all of you students and educators here. I want to express our gratitude to Colorado College for once again supporting this event, and I'd like to especially thank Joe, who you just heard from, who has chaired this event for several years now. We have several wonderful speakers to whom I'm grateful, and you will be hearing more about each of them as the program progresses. And finally, I'd also like to thank my staff who has helped to work on this event with me, and so please recognize Erin Esparson right here in the front row, and Masha Popovich right here. Today, we welcome outstanding students from 10 local high schools. We have with us today representation from Pine Creek High School, Village High School, Siva Charter High School, Air Academy High School, Fountain Valley School, and through the WorldLink Student Exchange, several international exchange students who are enrolled at Palmer Ridge High School, Lewis Palmer High School, Banning Lewis Academy, Peyton High School, and Douglas County High School. And to all of you and to the educators, thank you for sharing your students with us. This symposium is an annual event of the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council and is one of our most cherished and respected events. We believe that our most important mission involves the education of our youth on global affairs. You here today are the leaders of tomorrow, who will inherit the challenges facing our nation and the world of the 21st century. As you know, today's program is entitled Climate Change. Can we meet this global challenge? I quote from the United Nations Climate Action page on youth activity. Young people's unprecedented mobilization around the world shows the massive power they possess to hold decision makers accountable. Their message is clear: the older generation has failed, and it is the young who will pay in full with their very futures. Young people are not only victims of climate change, they are also valuable contributors to climate action. They are agents of change, entrepreneurs, and innovators. Whether through education, science, or technology, young people are scaling up their efforts and using their skills to accelerate climate action. So I have faith in you, our future leaders. Many wonderful things are ahead, and it is our pleasure at the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council to do our best to help you become prepared for these tasks. So with that, I will stand aside and let Joe take the podium.
As an overview of the issue, climate change is a reality. Global warming is strongly correlated with increased greenhouse gas emissions over the past 2 centuries. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2023 report cites widespread and increasingly rapid change in our atmosphere, oceans, cryosphere, and biospheres, with intensified adverse impacts related to climate, natural disasters, water availability, food production, and human health and well-being. Despite some progress lowering greenhouse emissions and adapting to climate risks, global warming will contribute to growing extremes in climate. Every aspect of human life is vulnerable. These are science-based facts. Although some parts of the world are more vulnerable than others, none of us, as we are well aware, is immune. The most dangerous scenarios can be avoided, but only if there is action in our lifetimes. Otherwise, our planet is in peril. So as Karen mentioned, today's program will discuss this issue with you, the future leaders. I'd like to give just a broad overview, as reflected in our programs, of how this morning's events will take place. In a moment, we will have our keynote address, and then followed by a short break where we will ask everyone to leave the theater for just a couple of minutes to refresh yourselves. Then we're going to have a panel with climate activists, climate advocates, and scholars, 2 in person and 2 over Zoom. Another short break where we will convene in roundtable discussions in the classrooms. And then one of you from each group will have the opportunity to stand up here and discuss what your group is thinking about for how to address this issue. Okay, if I could ask Karen to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
So it's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker. John Goldin Debois is the president of Western Resource Advocates, a nonprofit advocacy organization that works to fight climate change to sustain the environment, economy, and people of the West. During John's tenure at WRA, the organization has led efforts that have resulted in the planned closure of dozens of coal-fired power plants, the investment of billions of dollars in clean, renewable energy, the protection of hundreds of miles of western rivers, and the protection of over 7 million acres of land in Colorado and New Mexico. John's 30-plus year career includes leadership of state, regional, and national nonprofit organizations, and work on issues including government accountability, campaign financing, fair elections, youth and international development, consumer protection, environmental protection, and climate change. Please help me welcome John Goldin Debois.
Good morning. Let's see if we can make this work. All right. Thank you, Joe and Carr College, and thank you, Karen and the Colorado Springs World Affairs Council for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. And thank you all for being here this morning. Let's see if we can get this right. All right. All right. Is there hope in addressing climate change? Well, let's set the stage. Globally, the last 8 years have been the hottest 8 years on record. This summer was the hottest summer on record. So we are likely for 2023 to become the hottest year ever on record. It has been a devastating year for wildfires around the globe. In Canada, the most serious fires they've ever had have had severe implications for air quality across Canada and across much of the United States, particularly the Midwest and the East. Fires across Greece and of course in Maui led to massive evacuations, destruction, and loss of life. At the same time, we've seen catastrophic flooding. Juxtaposing those two sets of disasters is hard to do because 2 weeks ago in Greece, which was one of the countries that suffered the most from forest fires over the course of this past year, in Greece, they had double the annual average rainfall in 12 hours. Of course, in Libya last week, catastrophic flooding and loss of thousands of lives. What we know is that our weather everywhere is becoming more extreme, and because of warmer ocean currents and temperatures, hurricanes have increased in strength and in the damage that they create. The realities of climate change are already having profound impacts on people and on nature. Between 20 and 25 million people are displaced each year right now due to severe weather driven by climate change. The global climate crisis could see more than 1 billion people displaced between now and 2050, as ecological disasters drive mass migrations and greater armed conflict around the world. Now, closer to home and around much of the western United States, we experienced record-breaking heat this summer, of course. This continues in Arizona this week, where they still have temperatures well over 100 degrees. And here at home in Colorado, we had a very wet winter. But in spite of that, it came in the midst of 22 years of drought, the longest drought in at least 1,000 years. What's happening is less precipitation is falling as snow, and less water is stored in our reservoirs for downstream users and for future use. The water we have is evaporating faster, and we've seen devastating wildfires right here in Colorado as well. We've seen severe and catastrophic flooding right here in Colorado, much like the rest of the world. And because of the warming climate, we have less water in our rivers, 20% less water in the Colorado River over the last 20 years. The Arkansas River down here in this part of the state will lose between 12 and 28% of its volume because of increased heat and because of a drier climate this century. Air quality continues to deteriorate in our cities, including many places along the Front Range of Colorado, and the warming climate makes our air quality worse. In all of these impacts, those who have the least and who are the most susceptible to the negative impacts of climate change include people of color in both urban and rural communities, indigenous people, and people with lower incomes. These are just the realities. They're the evidence and the impacts of a warming climate. What we know is that the average global temperature has risen 2 degrees Fahrenheit or 1.1 degrees Celsius to date. The best science tells us that we must limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, that's 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Fortunately, the world community came together in 2015 in Paris to adopt an agreement to reduce emissions consistent with the 1.5 degree goal, and that has led to some progress. The facts show, though, that we move much too slowly and that there's a rapidly narrowing window to raise our ambition and to implement existing commitments to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement and to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. You might have noticed the famous quote that I had up as I started. It was written by Albert Einstein in 1946. It was after the close of World War II. And what Einstein said, the part of the quote that is frequently quoted is, you cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war. But Einstein went on to say that the very prevention of war requires more faith, courage, and resolution than are needed to prepare for war. Unfortunately, this is exactly what we must do. We must simultaneously prevent and prepare for climate change. Not because we've given up in our efforts to address climate change. We have to redouble our efforts to fight climate change and to reduce global warming emissions right now. But because we have waited so long that climate change is upon us and it's impacting us and people around the world today, we must also seek to prepare for the changes that we know are here or that are coming. And that, indeed, is going to require faith, courage, and resolution. And what I will add to that list of faith, courage, and resolution is hope. Because I hope that we can solve this daunting challenge. And I am hopeful. And I want to tell you why I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful because I see progress that we've already made. The big secret that you don't hear in the news and the conflict and the coverage of climate change is that people already know about it and they already want to work to address it. Our work fighting climate change is working. I'm hopeful because we know exactly what the challenge before us is. We know right now that we have to cut climate warming emissions by 50% by 2030 and by roughly 100% by 2050. So we know what the task before us is. It's well defined. I'm hopeful because we have demonstrated here in Colorado and in other states around the West that we can drive utilities to get there faster than we thought possible by closing down coal plants and committing to renewable energy. I'm hopeful because earlier this week, the largest utility in Colorado, Xcel Energy, announced that they will exceed the state's goal of generating 80% of all of the electricity they produce from clean, renewable energy, wind and solar, by 2030. I'm hopeful because we have developed and driven markets that have driven down the price of renewable energy, wind and solar power, to the point where renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy in almost every location around the United States and in almost every place around the world. I am hopeful because I know that policies that have been passed in the states, not at the federal level, policies that have been passed in the states have already begun to unleash the power to address climate change. California passed legislation in the early 2000s setting stronger pollution standards for vehicles. This eventually drove 17 other states to adopt those same standards, including Colorado, and it pushed automakers to develop cars that are better for drivers and that are better for the planet. This process is happening again as California once again leads in advancing clean electric vehicles, cars, and trucks. As a result of these state policies, most of the major automakers have already agreed to phase out the internal combustion engine. Now, we need them to act much faster, but it can be done. It's happening, and it's happening because of policy that's passed in the states. I'm also hopeful because the American public wants to see change. Over 2/3 of Americans say today that they support 100% clean renewable energy by 2035. I'm hopeful because the Biden administration and the Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act just last year. That's our nation's biggest investment ever. In fact, it is the world's biggest investment ever in resources to fight climate change. It will bring hundreds of billions of dollars to the fight against climate change. And I'm hopeful because the combined state action that's already taken place has resulted in nearly 30% of locked-in emissions reductions. 30%. That doesn't get us to 50%, but 30%. But when you combine that with the federal resources that are now on the table from the Inflation Reduction Act and from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, it's estimated that we're in the 40 to 43% range of emissions reductions that will be locked in. So we don't have to eat the whole apple in one bite. We're getting closer and closer. But it means that we need sustained action. This is just in the United States. It's not enough here. And it doesn't help other places in the world. We must do more by exceeding the 50% emission reduction goal, and then we can help other nations to do that as well. With concerted action, we can get there. Now, we have to do more. We have to do more. And we have to do it faster. To address climate change, we must reduce emissions across all sectors of the economy, and we must do it very, very quickly. This is particularly important in the United States and other industrialized countries where most of the emissions come from. Here are 4 things that need to happen. First, the leading utilities have already shown that they can reduce climate warming pollution faster than required, and they can get to 80% reductions in climate warming emissions with existing technology. Existing technology. So we need to make all utilities do this and do it now by ending reliance on coal and by investing in clean, renewable wind and solar energy paired with batteries to the maximum extent possible and as quickly as possible. In the transportation sector, there is a revolution happening right now in the sector. Clean electric vehicles. How many of you have ever been in an electric vehicle? Okay, if you've been in one, here's what you know. The vehicles are superior to internal combustion engine vehicles. Their prices are dropping quickly. Their battery range is becoming equal to gasoline-powered cars, and more models are becoming available every year. Each of the states in these United States should adopt California Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Truck Standards, which phase out fossil fuel-powered vehicles over the next 13 years and require the adoption of electric vehicle technology. All of the major automakers, as I said before, have already committed to phasing out the internal combustion engine. We just need them to act more quickly. The next big set of challenges comes in 2 areas. First, we must move our homes, our businesses, and our buildings from heating and cooling and cooking powered by fossil fuel gas to heating and cooling and cooking powered by clean electricity. And second, we must electrify and find clean energy sources for hard-to-serve industrial customers that need to use a lot of energy, like in the concrete and steel industries and in air travel. This is me. In 2021, I had the rare opportunity and the time to hike the 486 miles of the Colorado Trail. That trail starts just outside of Denver, not too far from where I live, and it ends in Durango, in southwestern Colorado, on the other side of the mountains and on the other side of the state. And for 32 days, I lived outside, I slept on the ground, and I put one foot in front of the other. I remember on the 25th day, so I was nearing the end of the trek, and I was in the Weminuche Wilderness in the San Juan Mountains. And on the last high ridge, I was rushing to get across a very, very high ridge because a storm was moving in and I could see it. And I could see the ominous clouds and I could see the rain falling in the distance, but at the same time, the light was perfect. You know, just that evening light coming through, and it was shining down on these vertical walls that were carved out of lava that flowed 20 million years ago. And it reminded me that there are so many spectacular places of beauty in this world, and in particular in the West, that are worth protecting. And while this journey was extraordinary, and you can see I look happy in all those pictures, there were some pretty tough days because day after day and mile after mile and step after step, and let me tell you, blister after blister, I and those that I met along the trail carried on even when it was difficult and even when it felt like I couldn't take another step. And I think that in many ways, when I think about this journey and I think about climate change, it illuminates for me that this is what progress takes. It can be slow, it can be hard, and it can be painful. And progress on climate change, I know, follows this same pattern. But step by step, and mile after mile, and day after day, we make progress. Because something worth achieving takes persistent and concerted action, often in the face of significant obstacles. The reality is that we all know that climate change makes all of us less safe, and it makes us less secure, and it threatens the things that we love. So, what is it that we must do now? And more specifically, what is it that you should do? And that's what I want to talk about, because you are the key ingredient in this equation. The question is one for each of us to answer for ourselves, but I have an answer. My answer is do everything you possibly can, but do something. Yes, each of us should make the small changes in our personal lives. Live in line with what it is that you value. But also know that you cannot do this alone, and that all of the small changes will contribute, but they will not solve the problem and challenges we're facing with the climate crisis. Because this is a collective challenge, and it requires societal change and collective action, and you, each one of you here today, can play a role in advancing that collective action. So I want to ask you, what discomfort will you step into to play a role in advancing that change? What will you do in these next 7 critical years to put us on path to address climate change? I can tell you right now that the political leaders at every level of government and of both parties are moving too slowly, far too slowly, to reduce emissions fast enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. They're moving too slowly if we hope to adapt to climate change. If Frederick Douglass, who was a great abolitionist in the 19th century, was right when he said, "Power concedes nothing without demand." The question becomes, how will you interact and respond to power? To political and business leaders. Will you demand that our elected officials step up to address this crisis to make a bright future a possibility? We know that we have to accelerate our efforts at a pace and a scale beyond what we've ever achieved before. We have to lock in policy commitments today so that there's time for them to be implemented to reduce emissions consistent with the goals for 2030. We know that without urgent action to address climate change, rising temperatures, drought, wildfire, and the destruction of habitat will have increasing and profound effects on both people and on nature. The world's leading scientists have this to say. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss the brief, rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. So, what can you do? And what will you and your generation do? What can you as young people today do to protect your future in spite of the fact that previous generations have not acted fast enough or effectively? And while this is not an exclusive list, here are 10 things you can do. Actually, I'm going to add an 11. Here are 11 things you can do. First, learn all you can, because information put to good use is powerful. Second, discuss climate change, your fears, your hopes with your community. Speak to your parents, to teachers, to administrators, and to community leaders, city councilors, and county commissioners about your views on climate change. Third, make sure that those who are elected to represent you hear your voice and understand your concerns. Fourth, if those same elected leaders don't adequately represent your viewpoint, go out and seek to change who represents you. Campaigns need volunteers and they need staff. Go to work for climate champions that share your viewpoint. Fifth, seek out and engage with and support organizations that represent and advance your interests and your perspective. Sixth, take personal steps to reduce your climate impact. Walk when you can, ride your bicycle, take public transportation, absolutely. Seventh, enjoy the beauty that surrounds you. We live in a world that is difficult, but that is also awe-inspiring. Right here in Colorado Springs, one of the most beautiful places in the country, seek solace, seek peace, seek energy, and strength to make the world a better place in the places you love and with the people you love, because there is a rejuvenating power in nature. Number 8, do something. You may work hard, you may grow weary, but do something to fight climate change and its impacts. Number 9, don't stop. It is hard to continue to work on climate change day in and day out, but don't stop. Your efforts will make a difference. Number 10, if you stop, start again. Keep going. And number 11, I want to add, because just yesterday, President Biden established America's Climate Corps. And that passage of that will provide jobs and training for tens of thousands of young people like yourselves to work to fight climate change and its impacts. And one of the panelists that you're going to have later and the organization that they represent worked on this, and it's a huge victory that now there's going to be actual jobs working to fight climate change, both at the federal level. There's a similar program here in Colorado already. You are powerful and you have a lot to fight for. And the next few years will determine our future. I'm not giving up, and I'm not going to let our leaders give up either. The challenges ahead seem daunting, and I know that through perseverance, through hard work, we can dramatically and quickly cut climate warming emissions, and we can avoid not all impacts, but the worst impacts of climate change. And I believe with every ounce of my being that we together can drive policies that put this region on track to reduce emissions consistent with the science, and that can lead to the long-term protection of our communities, of the rivers that I love in the West, and that can protect habitat and the vast majority of species from the worst impacts of climate change. I know that what we do today, what each one of us does today and over the next 3 years, is what will either put us on track to address the climate crisis or ensure that we fall farther behind. So if you take one thing away, just one thing away from our conversation here today, it is that making progress in the fight against climate change and its impacts is a shared challenge. We must all do our part, and we must work together. So before we take questions, I just leave you with the thought: what will you do? Thank you. All right, I think we have time for questions. There's 2 microphones. And those that have questions, we're going to have you come up to one of the microphones. I see a hand up already, but we're going to have you come on up to one of the microphones to ask the questions. Okay?
They can line up.
All right, so I saw you there. Why don't you come up and you get the first question.
And you guys can line up behind each other, yeah?
Yeah, you can all just make lines.
Hi. So my question, I didn't really get, what I'm trying to say is, you said that by 2030 we need to cut our carbon emissions by 50%. At what year do you think that we need to cut it by 100%? And why do you think, and like by that year, is our goal like heat, is it going to be drastically more deathly?
Great question. So I'm going to paraphrase your question, okay, and just you nod if I get it right. So the question is, we need to cut climate emissions by 50% by 2030. What percentage do we need to cut by 2050? And if we reach those goals, what are the implications for the temperatures around the world?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, good. So yeah, 50% by 2030. It gets complicated, right? This is all from 2005 levels. So we need to cut climate emissions by 50% by 2030 from the levels that existed in 2005. By 2050, we have to cut climate warming emissions almost by 100%. So that means we need to no longer be using fossil fuels to heat, to cool, to generate electricity, to drive our cars, to power industry. If we are able to do that, if we're able to cut 50% by 2030 and close to 100% by 2050, then what scientists believe is we can limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. That will still have impacts. So far we're at about 2 degrees Fahrenheit of temperature increase, and we're seeing those impacts already. So it still means there will be further warming, but it will eliminate the possibility of the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. Thank you. Let's go to this side and we'll go back and forth. Okay?
So as we move towards more electric vehicles within just general society, how can we ensure that there aren't negative impacts of lithium mining as we're already seeing today as we mine more lithium?
Yeah, great question. So the batteries that power electric vehicles are one of the elements of them is lithium. There's a variety of different types of batteries and components in batteries. To get to those minerals, it requires mining and hard rock mining to extract those. Of course, our society has, for the last 200 years, been involved in mining of minerals, whether it's oil, whether it's gas, whether it's coal. All of those things have the localized impacts of mining, but also the global impacts of climate warming. So what we're really trying to do is figure out how do we solve for climate change, and how do we do the mining that is necessary to power our economy, whether it's our vehicles, whether it's battery storage for electricity, how do we do that more responsibly? That has to be a part of the equation. Over time, we have gotten much better at reducing the impacts of mining, localized impacts of mining. The other thing that I will add is that batteries, no matter the type of the battery, are also recyclable. So we get that added benefit of we do need minerals for them, but we can also use and reuse those minerals that we use for other battery applications. So great question. As you step up to the mic, can you just introduce yourselves?
Hi there, I'm Micaiah from Siva Charter High School. I'm just curious, you mentioned the point in your fantastic presentation that those who contribute least to climate change are those who are most affected by it.
Yeah.
I feel like that's a really powerful point, and with the education of our populace on the effects of climate change, that would be a really impactful thing to convey. What do you think would be the best way to convey that? And then once we have that education and that knowledge within our population, would the change that we need to see happen best at the state or federal level?
Okay, great question. Two questions really, right? So one is about impacts on those who have both had the least, who have done the least to contribute to climate change. And the second question is really, where does change need to happen at the state level, federal level, et cetera? To your first question, yeah, I mean, all the evidence shows that those people who are most vulnerable to climate change are those people who are the poorest, those people who have the least, those people who have contributed least to the problem. So it's a tragedy that we have kind of forced onto people in those sets of circumstances. That is true whether it's in industrialized nations or whether it's in countries that have yet to industrialize. And so if you look just in the urban context in the United States, pregnant mothers in New York City of low income are one of the most vulnerable populations in this country. So one of the things that we can do to prevent this, whether it's on the global scale or whether it's on a localized scale, is tell the stories of the people who are impacted by this. Because people need to make a connection to real people to understand the circumstances, the challenges, and what's being posed in these circumstances vis-a-vis climate change. So I think storytelling is really critically important. To your question of where does change need to happen? I don't know if any of you all saw the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. It needs to happen everywhere all at once. It means we need to be working with our local government officials to get them to take steps and actions that reduce climate change, and importantly, the impacts of climate change. You'll remember that I talked a little bit about the impact that climate change is having on our rivers. Well, it's diminishing the amount of water that's in our rivers, here in the West in particular. Local governments have a lot of power to reduce the water that we use in our communities. 50% of the water that we use along Colorado's Front Range is used to water the grass. So in a climate impacted future, is that the best use of a scarce resource that we want to be taking out of the ground, out of our rivers to water grass in a median on a highway? No is the answer. So local government has a real role to play. State government has an absolute role to play. As I said, most of the progress to date on climate change has taken place because of state level action, whether that's California and 17 other states adopting clean car standards, whether it's the state of Colorado taking action that's resulted in the closure of almost every coal plant in the state by 2030, whether it's the same types of actions that have happened in other places. So the state government has a huge role to play. The power of the federal government shouldn't be underestimated. The billions of dollars that are going to come out of the hundreds of billions of dollars that are going to come out of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law are going to be critical in the fight against climate change. Ultimately, we want the federal government to act even more decisively to stop the use of fossil fuels. At this moment, I don't have a lot of hope for that happening between now and 2026 or 2027. But if we can continue to take decisive action at the local level and at the state level, we can keep us on path and get the big gains at the end from additional federal government action. Great question.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
From SpeakerJon High School. I'm just asking a clarifying.
You might need to step a little closer.
Okay, sorry. I'm just asking a clarifying question about how you touched on. You touched on electric cars and the internal combustion chamber. What specifically is that, I suppose?
So gas-powered engines, gas and diesel-powered engines, yeah.
And then also to go on to that, we are expecting that, we are hoping that we will go with almost fully electric cars by 2030, correct?
So California law, there's this exemption in federal law that allows states to set their own standards if they follow California. So California set its own standards. A bunch of states have followed California. The California law outlaws sale of internal combustion engines, so gas-powered engines, after 2035. What's happening in the auto industry is incredibly interesting. So they're racing to introduce more electric models, and they're extending in range. And so the real question is, will it actually happen faster than that? Just because of market demand. What's happening in all the states that have adopted the clean car standards, so the California standards, is their sales are doubling and in some cases tripling the goals that are established through those standards. Because people drive these cars and they're like, wow, this car is better. There's no maintenance costs. There's very little fuel cost. So the question, I think, is, can we drive that transition even faster? If we can drive that date up to 2032, 2033, that'll save millions and millions of tons of emissions.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yes.
Hello, my name is Ryan and I'm from Bangladesh. I'm an exchange student. So I was really glad when you said that USA is thinking of helping other nations about this thing. So my question is that how do you think USA can help other nations in the route of climate change? Because I know that UNICEF and United Nations organizations are working together to help help pre- help prevent climate change. Even in our country, UNICEF created like a big organization. They worked with Generation Unlimited to. I think they organized a workshop and a boot camp of like bringing in students and making business together to. They funded us like a few grants, and we worked on a product that will help prevent against climate change. So what do you think US is doing to help other nations?
Okay. So I think the United States and other industrialized nations have a large responsibility to the rest of the world. We have that large responsibility because we've been the largest emitters of climate warming emissions, so US, China, and other industrialized nations. And so we have essentially pushed this problem onto those who have less resources to address the problem and those who haven't really contributed as much to the problem. So our responsibility is large. So what do we do? I think there are several things. First, we should cut our own emissions as quickly as possible because every ton of climate warming emissions that goes out into the atmosphere harms other people everywhere around the world. So cutting our own emissions as quickly as possible is critical. Advancing international agreements that seek to move emissions reductions faster is another thing the United States should be doing, and we should be leading in diplomacy to get to those types of agreements. The third thing we should be doing, and where I think other nations are the US and other nations are falling down, is we've made these commitments to help countries around the world address climate change and the impacts. We haven't been very good at following through on those financial commitments to help those other nations. So we need to do more, we need to commit more, we need to make sure those dollars get on the ground into the places where they can be effective and where they can help people.
Thank you.
So my question, or I have two questions. My first one is, how big of a role do you think carbon capture is going to play, considering a wide percentage of them actually emit more carbon than they capture? And the second question is, with electric cars, there's still, even with the lithium batteries being recycled, there's still all sorts of other emissions with like the paving of roads, the metal, and like the glass. So what would we do about that? Should we move towards like public transport? So yeah.
Okay, great questions. So the first question, well, let me take the second question first, and then I might have you go back to the first one because I'm getting old and addled, and sometimes I forget the questions. Okay, so the second question is around electric vehicles, and it's really about transportation more than about electric vehicles. Your question is, how do we reduce emissions and the impacts of transportation overall? Electric vehicles is one piece of that equation because it doesn't use fossil fuels. It is a tremendous help in terms of addressing emissions of carbon and carbon equivalent warming gases. So moving to electric vehicles is a critical necessity. But you mentioned something that's critically important. We have to change the way we develop our communities, and we have to change the way we are able to get around in our communities. So by creating communities that are more dense, less sprawling, we can reduce the impact of transportation on our communities from the start. And if we build those smartly so that people can live and work close to where there are stores and where there's the services they need, we can dramatically cut emissions from that as well. But transportation public transportation and transit options is a huge part of this equation. So as an example, right now, the governor here in Colorado is thinking about creating a front range rail system from Fort Collins to Colorado Springs or Pueblo. That's exactly the kind of solution that we need to be advancing. Reducing all those cars that are coming up and down I-25 would have a tremendous impact. But then we also have to set systems of okay, so I got to the train station in Colorado Springs. How do I get to the CC campus? So we need to solve for some of those kind of problems. But you're absolutely right. It's not one thing. Huge, huge, huge part is electric vehicles, but we also have to be thinking about how our communities grow, how we shape them, and how we get around. That your other question was?
So, I was gonna ask, or did ask, how big of a part do you think carbon capture is gonna play?
Great question.
Because, yeah, because they emit more, or some emit more than they capture.
Yeah, so carbon capture is really a technology that it's in its infancy, and people are just now testing to see whether or not we can effectively capture the carbon molecules that are in the atmosphere right now. So essentially, there's two ways to do it. One is to take it in the production process, and one is to suck it out of the air. Neither of those technologies have, as of yet, proven to be effective and certainly not cost effective. The most important thing we can do right now is cut emissions as quickly as possible. Now, when we get into the out years, when we get into 2035, 2040, 2045, I think that carbon capture will likely play a role, and that technology will get better and better over time, and it could be very useful. We don't fully know the answer to that question yet, though some people are betting a lot of money on it. I would much rather see all of those resources going to cutting emissions right now today, and then we can start to worry about the last 20% of the emissions problem when we've gotten the reductions from 80% of the economy.
What do you say to those who deny climate change, and why do you think they think that?
Oh, that's a great question. It's a great question. I think, I will tell you the approach I take. If somebody at this day and age, and given the evidence, doesn't believe that climate change is real, I have to be honest with you, I don't spend a lot of time with them. The evidence is so overwhelming. I was reading a book from a woman who is the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy earlier this week, and she went through the preponderance of evidence. So there's thousands and thousands of studies that prove climate change. There's about 40 studies, about 40, that are thought to be credible studies that deny the existence of climate change. So some of the panels from the international panel from the UN panels on climate change said, well, let's take a look at these 38 studies and let's see if there's any real evidence that leads us to believe that they could be right and we could be wrong, because that's what scientists do, right? Scientists, they go through the scientific method to figure out what's right and what's wrong. They try to challenge each other's papers. They try to say, yes, this is right, no, this is wrong. So there's thousands of peer-reviewed, credible scientific studies. There's these 38 studies. Every one of those has been funded by the fossil fuel industry. So we'll start there. And then they went through them systematically to try and take apart the claims and try and replicate the results that those 38 studies came to. They couldn't get the same result. They couldn't get the same result because what they found was parts of the equation had been left out. They didn't consider some of the factors. So I don't spend a lot of time on it because I'm not going to convince the 20% or the 10% of the population that doesn't believe climate change is real, that doesn't see the evidence everywhere around us, much less the scientific evidence. I'm just not going to convince them. I am fine if 80% of the population believes and we get the reductions that we need. That works.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, I'm Gracie Johnson. I'm from Siva Charter High School. So you had stated in your speech that large industrial companies contribute a lot to climate change. And so I was just wondering if you see any solutions or if you have any ideas for what we would do with the blue collar workers that work at the large industrial companies and where we would replace them.
Yeah, so I want to kind of talk about this a little bit and go a little bit deeper because there's industry that we really need in this country. So as an example, let's take concrete, right? We need concrete for construction. Concrete emits a lot of climate warming emissions. The question is not whether we need those industries or not, but can we change their processes so that they emit less, or so that we can get to zero carbon emissions, or so that they can capture the emissions that they actually are currently emitting in their production processes. I think the answer to that is yes. It's more difficult in some industries. A former governor of Colorado, I was on a panel once, and a former governor of Colorado asked me, he said, well, tell me about the sustainability of the oil and gas industry in Colorado. And I'm like, well, there is no such thing as sustainability of the oil and gas industry. A, it's not a renewable resource, it's a finite resource. So by definition, not sustainable. And second, if we hope to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we have to get off of all fossil fuels, oil, gas, coal, all by 2050, completely, right? Hopefully by coal a lot sooner than that. So there are some industries that we can't support into the future because we can't protect our climate and have those industries continue to operate. I think it is a really good question. Well, what happens to the people that are involved in and engaged in those industries? Because I also believe that the worker in the coal plant or in the oil patch, they're not to blame for climate change, right? It's all of us that have chosen to go down this path of using fossil fuels to power our economy. That's the technology we had. So the workers in those places are not at fault. So a couple things we need to do. We need to ensure that we provide for a just transition. That means supporting those communities and those workers so that they can get other jobs and other livelihoods that provide them with a livelihood. In much of the work we've done to retire coal plants around Colorado and around the West, we've also provided resources that actually help those communities transition away from coal. In Pueblo, one of the most interesting cases, we worked with Xcel Energy to set retirement dates for the Comanche plant down in Pueblo. And what Xcel did is they said, okay, we're going to retire these coal plants, but we're going to put all of our renewable energy resources that we're going to build to replace those in the same place. So we got to have people to construct the plant, we got to have maintenance workers, we got to have, and not a single job is lost. In fact, it creates many more jobs than the 52 people that were employed in the coal plant. So right now in Colorado, if you take coal as an example, there's about 1,000 coal workers in Colorado. There's 60,000 people working in renewable energy. And we're just getting started. We're just getting started. So to transform our economy to a renewable energy economy is going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs.
I'm sorry, we have time for about 2 more questions. So.
Okay, we'll take one from each side.
Do you believe that there are large enough renewable power sources to power the steel and iron industries? I know you talked about that's one of the things we need to do. Do you believe in the future that there is a possibility of that happening with like renewable sources create a lot of energy, but there's also not enough to power like steel?
Yeah, excellent question. Excellent question. So the steel plant down in Pueblo is one of the places that we are talking about. In the conversion to renewable energy that Xcel Energy is driving in Pueblo at the Comanche plant, I mentioned that they're replacing those coal-fired power plants with a whole lot of renewable energy. The other thing they did as part of that is they made an agreement with Everest, who is the steel maker, to provide them with renewable energy to power much of their operations, not all of their operations. We do have a challenge to get to fully powering industry, which requires a lot of energy to power their needs to create the products that they create. Are we there yet today? No. Can we get there? Absolutely. You know, Xcel is saying they can meet 80% of all energy use. That's not just residential customers. That's residential, commercial, and industrial customers, 80% by 2030 with existing technology. So that's like the battery out of your car. You know, it's wind generating, saving, and storing that energy in the battery in your car. So as these technologies develop, I have no doubt that we can actually power those industries.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Olivia Sullivan from Cedar Charter High School, and you mentioned that by 2030 we needed to reduce the emissions by 50%, but that we are like in critical need of going faster at that. I wanted to know what we are on track for, this like separate from what we should be, and within that, if there are any critical actions or methodologies to reduce climate change that you think we should be taking but our governments are apprehensive to.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's hard to answer without getting to some specifics because some places are on track, other places are not on track, and some places we're not nearly on track. So as an example, if you look at the electric power industry in Colorado, so the sets of utilities that provide power for our electricity in our homes, they are all committed to and will be on path to reduce their emissions by 80% by 2030. At least 80%. Excel just announced the other day they're going to exceed that. So some industries are getting on track. Our region, California, a handful of states on the East Coast are on track to do that. Much of the Midwest in the US is not on track to do that. Globally, Europe's on track. China is not. China's still building coal plants. We haven't built coal plants here in the United States for several years, and I don't think another coal plant will ever be built here. So there's a question of, how quick within that one sector of the economy we can move. I think the technology is absolutely there. We need to move the political will in some states in order to advance that and among some countries. In the transportation sector, I have a lot of faith that we're just going to get there because of the superiority of the product and the fact that the product's continuing to drop, and there's federal resources, there's rebates, and there's tax incentives, so I think we'll get there in the transportation sector. I think we have a big challenge in the building sector and in the industrial sector. In the building sector, it's really easy with new buildings because it's cheaper today to build a home that is completely powered by electricity, so clean energy with heat pumps, cheaper today than to produce a home that's powered by dual fuels, which means electricity and then gas for heating and cooling and cooking. So that's great. But we have about 3 million buildings in Colorado that are existing that are dual fuel. We have to repower every one of those buildings to be powered by clean electricity. That's a big, big job. And then in the industrial sector, we're not there yet. I don't think we're there yet. We can drive a lot of these policies in the state. In fact, in Colorado, in 2021, we passed a piece of legislation that includes reductions in emissions from the industrial sector, and the state is now making a rule on this, and I would encourage all of you to speak with the Air Quality Control Commission, which is setting rules to reduce emissions in the industrial sector in Colorado right now. Right now, this is like a real opportunity where you can engage with this commission and tell them you want them to reduce emissions consistent with the climate science. So there's good news. There's good news there. Thank you so much for your question. And I want to thank all of you for your time today. I've really enjoyed this conversation and the opportunity to talk with you. Remember, I think number 9 on my list was do something. You will feel better. You will make a difference, and you will help reduce emissions, preserving your future and the future of this planet. So thank you all so much.
What an outstanding delivery. Thank you so much. We just wanted to present you with a small token. It's our little global paperweight to remind us of the planet that we all live on. And thank you again. Will you be leaving right away? Or
No,
will you
I'm
be
going to
around?
stay for the panel. Yeah.
Okay, so I wonder if you'd be willing, some of the students who didn't have a chance to chat maybe on the break, could they approach you?
Absolutely.
Okay, if you had a burning question, John will be in the lobby. So at this time, I need to ask everybody to clear the auditorium. We will take a break. We will reconvene at 9:45 for the panel discussion. But I do need everybody, I need the auditorium to be emptied right now. Thank you.